Hey, somebody needs to make a connection. You have? Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. You are listening to The Professional Noticer. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Andrews. Hey, thank you for making me a part of your week. My purpose here today and with every show we do is to play the part of a best friend or a coach. I want to help you live the life of your wildest dreams by giving you access to the greatest mentors the world has to offer today. The Professional Noticer is sponsored this week by our friends at Tucker ATV. You know, the sheer variety of power sport products at Tucker ATV will blow your mind. The Hustler turf equipment, the entire line of Echo power tools, and of course, Tucker ATV carries every make and model of Polaris ATVs. They have the big Polaris side-by-sides, the even bigger Ranger Cruise, and you have to see the showroom. Taxidermy, antique displays, and an indoor porch with its porch swing. Awesome chairs, television, free coffee. You need to stop in and meet Shannon and Lisa Tucker. They treat customers like family, which is why folks from 14 states have done business with Tucker ATV. Highway 43 North in Jackson, Alabama, Tucker ATV, the small town business with the national reputation. Observations and answers, that's what we do here on The Professional Noticer, and as you know, we love it when somebody comes to the table with both. We have that today. We have the author of quite a few nonfiction books about iconic Americans and iconic American happenings, and his new book is just out. Very excited about this. It's called The Wingmen. The unlikely, unusual, unbreakable friendship between John Glenn and Ted Williams. How much do you know about that? Probably not much. It's a good thing you're watching, isn't it? Please welcome Adam Lazarus. Hey, Adam, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. First of all, how did you find out that they were friends? I've never even heard of this.
Exactly. I knew a lot about both these men, being a baseball fan as a kid, and I'm from Ohio, so I knew a little bit about John Glenn as he was my senator when I was a kid. But I had no idea about this. And one day, it was actually Veterans Day. You know, people always pointing out military heroes and things like that. It was on Veterans Day. There was a post on the internet of this photo. It's actually a photo that's in the book of Ted Williams and John Glenn at the same Marine Corps base in 1953 in South Korea. And it just mentioned one line, did you know that Ted Williams and John Glenn served together in the Korean War? And I had no idea, and I was floored by that. And I wanted to see, you know, did they just run into each other, or was it something that happened by accident? And I started reading about it, and it was mentioned in a good amount of the biographies and, you know, obituaries for Ted Williams. But I had no idea about the extent of their friendship.
Yeah,
and when I started reading more about it.
Yeah, they weren't just friends. They flew together.
Yes. They flew up missions together. They were in the same small Marine Corps fighter squadron in Korea. It was called VMF 311. There was 20, 30, 40 pilots in those groups that flew missions into North Korea, dropping bombs on enemy ground troops and bunkers and shelters. And they were in the same group together, and they flew missions together. And at least more tthan a handful of times, John Glenn was the leader on a mission, and Ted Williams was his wingman. And that's where the title comes from. And it's an amazing story. And the military part is where it begins, but it spins forward to their time returning home and John Glenn's NASA years and their friendship that developed after that.
That is awesome. And, you know, both of these guys, to call them larger than life really understates the fact. I mean, both of these men have mythologies that have been just carried forward about them. And so obviously when you're getting into the weeds and you're researching characters and researching facts, how did you walk that line? And how, you know, I mean, and obviously, you know, you find somewhere somebody cussed, and that's gonna upset somebody. How do you deal with this?
Well, I think the most important thing for dealing with people like characters like this, who have had hundreds of thousands of pages written about them over the years, was I didn't really want to tell readers things they already knew. There were things in the story that obviously John Glenn going to space the first time and Ted Williams being a great baseball player, those were things that had to be in the book. But I didn't want to pour over the decades of every single year, every at bat Ted Williams had, or the months and years and all the training that John Glenn went through to become an astronaut. I wanted to tell the story from more of a unique perspective through the lens of this friendship. And I think that was the first goal that I had with this book, was to not just regurgitate things other people have written. There's a biography about Ted Williams called The Kid by Ben Bradley Jr. It's a tome. It's 700-800 pages. It's the definitive biography on Ted Williams. And I didn't want to fill the book with things that were just echoing in there. And even John Glenn wrote, several books have been written about him. He wrote his own autobiography, which is very, very large. And I didn't want to talk just at length about things that he had already, poured over many, many times in the past. And I think that was the real challenge with this. Like you said, these are larger than life figures, so people know a lot about them. Everybody knows about Ted Williams hitting 406, and everybody knows about John Glenn going to space. And that was the real challenge, was to not do that, to reinvent the wheel in a way.
One of the things that I am interested. I've gone through the book a little bit, but we just got this yesterday, and so I haven't had the opportunity to read it. But I love biographies. I learn from biographies, and I'm really looking forward to reading this one. And just what I know about these two guys, or let's put it this way: what I think I know about these two men would make them unlikely friends, because John Glenn always struck me as, and I have I have mutual friends that were friends with both these guys, and I've heard stories about it. And so John Glenn always struck me as this genteel, very mannerly kind of guy. And Ted Williams, just this kind of like a hothead, and kind of just like, okay, you are sentenced again to anger management. But and so, how did these two guys get together, and how did they manage that friendship, being so different?
Well, I think it started from their time in Korea. They were lumped together. They weren't bunkmates, but they lived in small quarters right next to each other. So, and it was a small squadron. They saw a lot of each other, and they flew these missions together. And if you read the book, the first mission they flew together, I don't want to spoil it, but John Glenn basically thought that Ted Williams was going to get him court-martialed. And I think so their friendship began sort of a baptism by fire. And they flew a handful of missions together that were very eventful after that. So that's sort of, I think, that how the bond began. And I don't, it's very interesting. I interviewed John Glenn's son, and we had a lot of talk about, he used to hear stories from his dad talking about the friendship with Ted Williams. And again, he pointed out what an unlikely friendship this is. And this is something I put in the book. He said something like, Dad found Ted a real character. Obviously, Ted Williams was larger than life and was a real character, but they were so different. And that was something that he thinks that may have been why they were, opposites attract in a way. I think John Glenn was maybe used to being with Marines who were, typical clean cut Marines, and Ted Williams was a nice change of pace for him. And I don't think John Glenn was impressed necessarily that Ted Williams was this two-time Triple Crown winner, best hitter in baseball. And I think Ted Williams appreciated that. And when he was in Korea, he had generals and colonels and everybody coming over. They didn't necessarily want autographs, although some did. They were falling all over themselves to see Ted Williams and talk to him about baseball and the Chicago White Sox game in 1948 and fishing and all those things. And John Glenn wasn't impressed by that. John Glenn that wasn't important to him. What was important to him was his service in the Marine Corps and Ted Williams doing his job. And I think that was something that Ted Williams appreciated from John Glenn, was he wasn't a fan. He was impressed with Ted Williams. He liked him, he respected him, but he wasn't a fan. And I think that was something that that held their friendship together. They were unique in that way. But you're absolutely right. In almost every possible facet of their personality and their lives, they were different. John Glenn was married to the same woman for decades, since his childhood sweetheart. Never, this is exaggerated a little bit, didn't swear, didn't drink, didn't smoke. That's the way everybody perceived him. Ted Williams had 3 wives and many mistresses and didn't get along well, didn't have a great relationship with his children, didn't get along with most people, didn't get along with the press at all, swore like a sailor, to use the expression. And they were an unlikely pair, but it worked. And if you read the book, I think you'll see why it worked.
I can't wait. I can't wait to read this. And, I understand that they did have kind of a falling out. And just like other families, it happened over politics.
I'm not really sure if you would call it a falling out or not. I don't, it was 40 years ago, so it wasn't the easiest subject to, resort to reference and to do my research on. But I did talk to some people who were close to the situation. Just to summarize, John Glenn ran for president in 1984, and he was a Democrat. He wasn't exactly the most left-wing liberal Democrat, but he was a Democrat for his whole adult life. And John Glenn and Ted Williams was as right-wing conservative Republican as you can get. And when John Glenn ran for president, his campaign sort of reached out and said, "Hey, Ted, would you consider giving us a little boost in the polls, just in the Democratic primary?" Obviously, John Glenn didn't win the nomination, so this was just the Democratic primary. And Ted Williams refused. I don't know if he refused. It doesn't seem like he refused in a negative way, because for years and years after that, he basically said he was sorry. He wished he could have done it, but his political mindset wouldn't let him. But I think it did bother John Glenn that Ted Williams wouldn't support him in that moment of need. I don't think it necessarily would have mattered. I don't think it's what kept John Glenn from being sworn into the White House.
Right.
But, we all have friendships like that. And I think that was something that I came across several times while I was researching and writing this book. Was I saw parallels in my own life and friendships that I have, and times where people have let you down and times when you could count on them. And I think that was something with John Glenn and Ted Williams. Their friendship you see over the course, especially the later years. When Ted Williams was dying, and he was in and out of the hospital, multiple surgeries, couldn't talk. John Glenn was one of the closest people in his life at the time, and you see that in the book. And I think it's a tale, as much as it's a tale of the military and everything that happened in the Korean War and military aviation history, and even the NASA stuff and baseball history and Ted Williams' home runs. It's a story about friendship and how friendships persist and continue and thrive.
Knowing what you know about this subject now, Adam, and all the research you did, the book, by the way, is The Wingmen, and this is the unlikely, unusual, unbreakable friendship between John Glenn and Ted Williams. Knowing what you know now, with all the research you've done, what do you look at, or was there anything that when you found you thought, wow, that had never happened today?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is Ted Williams being 33 years old, being recalled to fight in a war in the middle of his baseball career. You could pick any active. I mean, you could pick a no-name player. You could pick the middle reliever for some team that's not in the playoffs, or the kicker on some football team that's in last place. They still wouldn't. You can't imagine, for a variety of reasons, they would never be called back into a war. And Ted Williams was the best hitter in baseball. Joe DiMaggio had just retired, so he was the biggest player, and he was the biggest figure in baseball. And baseball was the king of sports back then. He was really the biggest athlete in professional sports, and he got called back to fight in the Korean War. And there's a lot of backstory in the book about it, but he definitely didn't want to be recalled. He was very angry about it. He did whatever he could to get out of it. But once he got recalled, he sort of put his nose to the grindstone and decided, well, if I'm here, I might as well serve the public and serve the military. And he did everything he could to be a great fighter pilot, and went over to Korea and did his duty. So that's the thing, the machinations of how that happened from start to finish. January 1952, he's recalled. And by May, he's at a Marine Corps air training base learning how to fly jets. So
Yeah, I mean,
that's something that never would happen today.
Yeah, I mean, that's like right in the middle of their best years. Peyton Manning or Tom Brady being called into the military to go to Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It would never happen. I mean, obviously there's no draft, and things were different back then because everybody went to World War II, and a lot of guys chose to basically have this very distant relationship with the military. They were still in the Marine Corps. Like Ted Williams was one of these guys called a volunteer reserve, where they were basically still in the Marine Corps, but they didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to go to weekend retreats and training and keep hours flying. And Ted Williams kept his rank. He had become a captain, so he kept his rank. He didn't think he was going to ever be called back to war because the World War II had just ended. And then through a series of bad luck, I guess you would say, since he was still in the war, since he was still technically in the Marine Corps when Korea began, he was called eventually, and he couldn't get out of it. So yes, it was an era that would never happen today for a whole host of reasons. But just the picture of exactly Peyton Manning being pulled off the Colts in the middle of his career, or Michael Jordan being called off the Bulls, or even Brad Pitt or whatever actor you'd name, or the biggest movie star singer. It would never happen today.
Yeah, Jimmy Stewart
would be a public relations disaster.
Yeah, Jimmy Stewart was a pilot in World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and so so it's just like Jimmy Stewart. There's Tom Hanks going to Afghanistan.
Exactly.
Really?
I mean, I think of I know how big of a deal it was when Elvis got called into the army, but that wasn't during war,
right?
And he wasn't sent to fight whoever it would have been.
This is Ted Williams going to fight.
Yes, yeah, and there's at least one mission where he probably should have died. He was absolutely, this is detailed to an extent in the book, where his plane crashed at 225 miles an hour on a runway after everything in his plane failed from being shot up by ground fire. And there's another mission that's in the book where Ted Williams and John Glenn were flying together, and his plane crash landed again, and he absolutely could have died. So it's not just that he was called back into the military. It was not just that he was back into war. He very well could have died.
Unbelievable. Well, buddy, thank you for your time. I got one more question for you.
Sure.
And that was there anything that you learned? I mean, just finding about this connection is very cool. And I hope your book just goes through the roof. But finding out about this connection was cool. But was there anything that you found that you're like, wow, that's something that I've learned that'll stick with me that, I'll use? I mean, was there anything that impacted you personally?
Well, I think what I learned most from studying both of these guys, I like to, in all the interviews I do and everything I talk about the book, I like to give, the baseball people like to hear about Ted Williams, and some of the political people like to hear about John Glenn. So I try to keep it balanced that way. And the way that the best way I can answer your question is these, like you said at the start of this interview, that they were larger than life, which in some ways makes them cartoon characters.
Sure.
People think of Ted Williams, and most people who think of Ted Williams think he was a gruff guy, rude guy, maybe even a jerk. A lot of people did not like Ted Williams. And the flip side is John Glenn was, the Boy Scout. They talk about him in The Right Stuff as the clean Marine, the Boy Scout. And I think both of those images that a lot of people have, these sort of superficial, Wikipedia entry images that they have, are obviously, too simple. They're simplistic. It's not the truth. And I learned a lot about Ted from the Ted Williams perspective. Yes, he made a lot of mistakes in his life. He had a short temper. He had no patience at all, and it cost him, and it made his reputation what it was. But he also had a huge heart, and he cared a lot about people. He cared a lot about young children who were especially sick children. He did a lot with the Jimmy Fund in Boston. He's the most important figure probably outside of the doctors and the Jimmy Fund. He raised millions of dollars for cancer research for children, visited children in the hospital all the time, went to kids' homes, visited sick children, didn't want reporters following him there. So for everything that people think about Ted Williams, he had a good heart. That's the way I looked at it. And that was something I learned. And the flip side with John Glenn is I like to look at John Glenn as the clean Marine, the Boy Scout. And I think of all the people I've ever studied, he's as close to that, to living up to that as possible. But he wasn't perfect. He had his own flaws. And I think they reflected it in some, if you pick up the book and read the military area, not just in Korea, but his whole time as a fighter pilot. He did something called sniveling, which was sort of the military term is getting into jobs that you're really not supposed to, sort of sucking up in a way. We would call it sort of sucking up. And John Glenn sort of did that throughout his whole military career. He went and got assignments and was kind of a teacher's pet in a way, which surprised me that, this is a flaw in the guy. And if you read the book even some more, he was not exactly the most careful pilot. He took a lot of risks in the air, and that's something that angered a lot of his fellow Marines, especially his fellow Marines in Korea. He took a lot of risks, unnecessary risks, because he said he was trying to win the war, but he also felt like it was his duty to do so. And I think that was sort of a blemish on his mark. And even if you spin forward his political career, he had a very successful political career, but his campaign for president was really a failure, a huge failure. He should have been, I think he should have gotten a lot farther than he did. And I think they were mistakes that he made. They were his own errors in judgment and his own errors in being a stubborn candidate that cost him. And so it was, I don't like to denigrate John Glenn because I have tremendous respect for him, but it was sort of nice to see that this perfect Boy Scout had his flaws. And I think we can all relate to that. I can relate to that. John Glenn wasn't perfect because nobody's perfect. And I think it gave me a sense that, our heroes are larger than life, and we put them on a pedestal, and Mount Rushmore kind of characters, they're still human beings. And that was something that I came away with from writing this book.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a cool life lesson. Truly, because how many times have people told you and me that you guys are perfect, and we're like, no, we're not, and we have to convince people.
Yeah, I think it's a lesson for all of us who, I don't know if it was different in the 1920s or the 50s, or even when I grew up in the 80s. The hero worship that we do, I feel like even today it's even bigger with the Instagram and the influencers, and everyone has a video, an internet profile. Your heroes are still human beings, and I think that's something. They have their flaws. We also like to break down our heroes, and Ted Williams is a good example of people who like to pick apart. He was totally mistreated by the media, I think, in a lot of ways. But he served his country in 2 wars. He cared about people. He bent over backwards for children's cancer research. So I think it takes a little more than you can't describe these guys by one adjective or one sentence. It takes a whole book.
Yeah, and to understand a fickle public. We build them up and break them down. Man, thank you so much, Adam, for taking the time to be with us today. The book is The Wingmen, The Unlikely, Unusual, Unbreakable Friendship Between John Glenn and Ted Williams by Adam Lazarus. And Adam, your show notes, we'll put how to contact you on the show notes. And we appreciate your time and wish you the best with the book.
Well, thank you very much. And if you want to go to adamlazarusbooks.com, there's links there to purchase the book and can read more about it and see some of the reviews and see people who've read it and wrote some nice things. So that's the best place to go.
Yeah, I loved reading the endorsements. When you got Bob Costas and Tom Brokaw on your side, you're doing pretty good there.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, buddy.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Andy Andrews, the professional noticer, harnessing common sense and wisdom to plow through challenges all the way to an answer for you. And I think that'll do it for this week. Get us out of here, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to the boys and girls who aspire to become ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of another episode of The Professional Noticer. In a world where common sense has become a superpower, I'm harnessing the tiny bit of mental energy I have for you, seeking wisdom, making observations, and endeavoring to answer tough questions in a way that will empower your family and your business. I'm Andy Andrews. Until next week, goodbye. This episode of The Professional Noticer was produced by Matt Lemper. The Noticer theme written and performed by Sugarcane Jane. Dog tags for the cast and crew provided by Twinkle and Smoke of Beverly Hills. Additional financial consideration provided by The Hollywood Home for One-Time Stars. Located in Burbank on Ventura Boulevard, The Hollywood Home for One-Time Stars is a charitable organization dedicated to the physical and mental health of aging actors who were not fortunate enough to star in more than one television series. The Hollywood Home for One-Time Stars is supported by the Fred and Wilma Flintstone Trust. Mr. and Mrs. Flintstone readily admit that, but for breakfast cereal endorsements, they themselves might have needed The Hollywood Home for One-Time Stars. After their family show was canceled, neither Mr. Flintstone or his wife were ever cast in another role for movies or television. Sadly, their son and daughter, former child stars Pebbles and Bam Bam, have also been excluded from additional acting roles. Also currently living at the Hollywood Home for One-Time Stars is Shaggy Rogers and Velma Dinkley with their dog Scooby-Doo, Veronica Lodge, Betty Cooper, and Johnny Quest, none of whom ever acted again after their initial successes. Mentoring most of the younger crowd at the Hollywood Home for One-Time Stars is George Jetson. Now 87 years young, George is joined by Jane, his wife, daughter Judy, and his boy Elroy. The Jetsons hold family classes in Future Disappointments every Thursday evening. That's The Hollywood Home for One-Time Stars. Donations accepted by Venmo and PayPal.